What is the theory of morphic resonance? And why was its author Rupert Sheldrake considered so dangerous that his TED Talk was actually banned back in 2013? Well, first off, morphic resonance started in 1981 as a theory by a Cambridge biologist to explain the development and apparent self-structuring of different life forms. But what it ended up implying about the evolution of the universe, the workings of reality, and the nature of the mind was so profound that it could not be taken as anything less than either revolutionary and enlightening or pure scientific heresy. So why is there such a great disagreement between these two belief systems about the nature of the world? And what is so extraordinary about the structure of the universe as we know it that it requires an explanation reaching beyond even the confines of time and space? Today we'll answer all these questions and more in order to help you, the viewer, to grasp the tenets of this theory and develop a new perspective on what it is that reality fundamentally does. Before we try to unpack all of this, we need to first understand why this theory is necessary. I mean, what is it accounting for in the first place? Well, it turns out that our understanding of biological processes is not congruent with our physical understanding of the universe. And not because biological systems are just really complex physical systems, but because the nature of how they are structured may be fundamentally different in some way. The mechanistic perspective of biology asserts that organisms are just like machines. Though they may have many complex moving parts, you could still break them down and see it's just an arrangement of simple forces and reactions explained by physics. In principle, this mechanistic perspective implies that the entire structure of limbs, the brain, organs, and the step-by-step development of the biological structure must be present even when it is just a single cell. I mean, yeah, that's what DNA is for, right? Well, yes, but not entirely. What DNA really does is give the instructions for creating a variety of proteins. Now, some would argue that it is these proteins that, quote, know the form of the organism in some way and act like architects of biological forms throughout embryonic development and onwards. But if anything, Sheldrake thinks this is just passing the role of a designer to the proteins themselves, when in reality they are more like the tools by which the form actually emerges. He believes that although many biological functions can be reduced to a scientific explanation, that doesn't mean the whole intertwined complexity of the organism can be reduced in the same way. For example, recent studies done on 30,000 people identified 50 genes associated with height, yet those genes only explain 5% of the heritability of height, meaning we still don't even know why tall parents have tall kids. That being said, the whole of biology is predicated on the faith that one day, given enough time, data, and calculating power, we could fully understand the development of biological organisms. Even though most people take this perspective for granted as if it were already true, this is still just a fantasy. Such scientists assert that there exists some perfect mechanistic reason for, say, the folding pattern of a protein based on its polypeptide chain and amino acids. Although we now have software that can sometimes infer from similar proteins to predict folding patterns, we still don't know exactly why one protein form takes its specific structure. We have no explanation for what that fundamental mechanism is. Rupert Sheldrake believes he has such an explanation. Morphic resonance suggests that the variety of complex and miraculous forms and structures found throughout our universe should not be taken for granted. I mean, think about it. Just because oxygen and hydrogen, for example, can combine to form water, that doesn't mean that they necessarily will. Obviously, other combinations do exist, as well as no combination at all. The same is true for the variety of molecular compounds found all over the Earth and the universe which are necessary for life. Just because chemistry proves that they can come together to form one structure, doesn't mean that they always have. We have the advantage of hindsight in these cases where instead of having to predict which molecular compounds will take place, we can instead trace back how they could have taken place and assume it must have always happened the same way. I know this is probably confusing. It basically goes against everything you were taught to think in chemistry class, but I promise this is going somewhere, so let me give an example. Alright, so chemists want to synthesize a bunch of different molecular crystal compounds for medical and technological applications, right? Often they have a goal for a crystal structure, one that can theoretically form given a molecular arrangement of different atoms and how they bind to each other. Easy enough then, just put the right elements in the right conditions and soon enough they'll click-clack into place like Lincoln Logs, right? Well, not so fast. It actually can take years and years to synthesize a specific crystal, as there are many potential structures and combinations that could form from just a few basic elements. But pay attention to this next part because it might blow your mind. Okay, so once a crystal structure is synthesized, it immediately becomes much easier to synthesize the same structure all over the world. So what this means is that the crystal structure is very hard to form initially because the structure does not actually exist yet. It is only theoretical. But once the structure is formed and actualized, then the universe in a way almost knows how to recreate it, which allows for it to be synthesized much more easily from then on. A lab in China may have been trying to synthesize one specific compound for years, then all of a sudden it happens almost overnight, only to find it was done in Italy the day before. There's really no mainstream scientific explanation for this effect, because it suggests that somehow a structure could be communicated across empty space, which seems impossible. The structure could only be physically communicated by some miraculous contamination with the formed crystal, which is actually how chemists explain away this phenomena, saying that crystal seeds must somehow be hitchhiking on the beards of traveling chemists. Obviously, this is just a laughable explanation, a narcissistic way of reaffirming the ideology of the mechanistic universe, scared by the possibility that there could be something at play that we just don't understand yet. But surely there is. Why else should boiling points of such compounds increase and become more stable over time after repeated synthesis? Rupert Sheldrake suggests that the form of certain synthetic crystals have reinforced themselves as they became more common, leading to an increase in melting and boiling points over time, as the data shows. So if morphic resonance can apply in this way to inanimate synthetic structures, then how does it apply to the shaping of living biological forms? Well, the concept of a morphogenetic field has actually been around for some time, first proposed by Soviet biologist Alexander G. Gurwitch in 1910, as a way of explaining the necessary wholeness in seemingly purposeful development of embryos. Most mainstream biologists believe some form of these fields exists and agree that cells must have a sense of positional information which regulates their development. But they disagree with Sheldrake on these fields actually being real, and instead assert that there must be some purely physical way that this information is being communicated. But in many cases, a physical explanation using DNA as the sole carrier of information does not actually seem to be possible. In a series of experiments done by C.H. Waddington in the 1950s at Edinburgh University, generations of fruit fly eggs were exposed to a chemical called ether, which caused the formation of a bithorax gene phenocopy in the developed fruit flies. This meant that the fruit flies, when exposed to ether, would develop an extra set of wings on their lower abdomen, which would not have formed in normal conditions. And after generations of offspring being exposed to ether and developing this trait, some offspring would still develop this trait even without being exposed to ether. This led Waddington to propose that the morphogenetic development of these organisms was influenced not only by their DNA, but actually arose from a Chreode, a word he coined to describe a specific reinforced pathway of development. So basically, after generations of having their development altered, this pathway of bithorax gene expression became strongly reinforced in the fruit flies so that the Chreode would apply even under normal circumstances. This gives us an insight into the process of morphogenesis, the way an organism develops through all its different parts in order to reach its whole form. As we know, an organism starts with just a kind of seed, a single tiny cell, no form of arms, eyes, brain, anything, just complete potentiality. But over time, structures develop throughout this embryo which self-organize in a way that seems to strive towards some final form. This final form is called an attractor. Even in circumstances where a two-celled urchin embryo has one cell removed, it does not form half of a sea urchin, rather it forms a whole sea urchin half the size. Or in the case of a dragonfly egg, where it is only given half the egg to grow, it still finds a way to develop to its full form within the new environment. I mean, we know this. Species are very adaptive and can somehow kind of unconsciously find a way to develop and grow around very prevalent obstacles. So what this implies is that the wholeness of an organism driven by its attractor is principal throughout its entire form, especially during morphogenesis. The whole is contained in the part just as the part is contained in the whole. The interconnectedness and collective goal of the embryo is necessary for the actualization of any single part, such as the apical ectodermal ridge, which is the initial structure necessary for the development of limbs. This harkens back to the idea of holons, which I've gone into on this channel before, but basically holons are an integration of different parts which are themselves smaller wholes. But the holon influences the actions of its parts in a way that transcends the parts themselves. This explains why biological structures are measured to behave more randomly when isolated from the rest of the organism. Morphic resonance uses this perspective to suggest that the size or shape of the organism is not predefined at the moment that first cell inherits its DNA. This kind of just gives the tools by which the organism can develop, but the form itself emerges over time as a result of influence by other existing forms from the same species. This pathway then becomes reinforced and sometimes modified through the course of evolution, as we've seen with rapid developments in species over time. So this gets us into the crux of morphic resonance. This is why crystals synthesize at the same time, why species develop in the same way in different conditions, and why some organisms can develop a whole new body just by cutting off a part. Because existing forms and structures contain morphic fields, and it is the sum of these fields which influence the development of similar forms across time and space. Okay, so this is where we venture into almost metaphysical territory, these fields. Sheldrake proposes that these morphic fields might exist within a morphological space that is invisible to the everyday physical world, which reminds me of Plato's metaphysical theory of forms. But that's not to say that these forms exist outside of the earth and make some kind of divine impression on it, but rather this morphological space communicates the structure of already existing forms like in living species. Now I know you're probably asking, how come we haven't measured these fields? That is because they operate within the laws of physics by using a probability distribution. This probability distribution implies that there is no one set form of lion, for example, but rather the attractor which directs development is somewhat an averaging of all the lions to ever exist, more so influenced by its ancestors and even subtly influenced by similar species. Sheldrake makes note of specifying that these fields are not really metaphysical, but are well within the physics of a universe that operates on a basis of habits rather than concrete laws. So these probability distributions form and act as a result of very real electromagnetic fields and real structures, and it is these structures that sort of change the universe in a way that reinforces itself. So it's like if we changed the speed of light. It would apply across time and space and wouldn't violate physics because it sets the definition for physics itself. Now you're probably thinking, but you can't change the speed of light. Well, we'll get more into this, but actually the speed of light has been changing according to quite precise measurements taken over decades, and we see this with other constants as well. So this probabilistic field can change much in the same way, and reinforce its structure by, for example, allowing enzymes to guide a substrate into its active site and therefore induce a biological reaction. This distribution field therefore moves an organism faster towards a more stable structure by using the pathway carved out over time by many past organisms. These fields are able to act on atoms and molecules because they are less rigid in their physical possibilities than we usually think they are. Thanks to 20th century advancements in quantum physics, we now know that everything in the universe fundamentally vibrates. Particles are not just some billiard balls predictably bouncing around. They cannot be defined in their position or momentum. They are rather made of a distributed wave of probability, implying that the outcome of small-scale events is not fully predictable. This provides an avenue for atoms and molecules to resonate with the vibration of other similar vibrational structures and be influenced by those other forms. I think of it kind of like if you had two Chladni plates and they were the same size and shape. If you applied the same frequency, you would see the same structure emerge. So because of this randomness caused by quantum indeterminacy, there exists space for many different potentialities to actualize while still working within the laws of physics. Organisms and embryos are therefore much more like radio receivers, tuning into and resonating with a 3D vibrational structure made by similar forms. But this idea of resonance with past similar forms extends far beyond just biological development. Let's start by looking at one very profound and mysterious experiment. Starting in 1927, William McDougall, a British psychologist, was using rats to test the existence of Lamarckian inheritance, the hypothesis that organisms could pass down traits and knowledge developed in their lifetime to their offspring. He set up an experiment where a rat would be dropped into a pool of water which had only 2 exits. One exit would be brightly illuminated and the only other exit was very dim. Naturally, the rat, which can swim by the way, don't worry, would choose the bright exit because they could see the path and wanted to get out as fast as they could. But when they did so, the rat was given an electric shock. Over many trials, the individual rat would eventually learn to associate the bright exit with the electric shock and instead go down the dim path where they would not receive any shock. The test would be brought to an end when the rat was able to make 12 successive exits through the darker path, meaning that they had clearly learned to avoid the bright path and the shock. Initially, it would take hundreds of trials until the rats learned to take the darker path, as you can see from this data, but amazingly, as the generations went on, it would take less and less trials for the rats to associate the bright path with the electric shock and avoid it. So this clearly implies that something was passed down these generations which was not contained in the DNA of the rats as mechanistic biology would suggest. I mean, it should not be possible to have gotten these results given that DNA is the only thing passed down from parent to offspring and learning does not impact DNA. But this learned connection or Chreode between the bright light and the electric shock was not only passed down to the offspring but also to the control group as well. That's right, even rats whose parents were never exposed to this experiment also learned to avoid the bright side faster, with some even doing it on their first try. What this implies is that the form or neural structure in the brain influenced the entire species through morphic resonance, in such a way that the structure formed more easily or even automatically in other similar organisms. This implies that there must be some kind of collective memory shared by similar organisms. This reflects Carl Jung's idea of the collective unconscious, which recognizes that certain archetypes and mythologies are found across isolated cultures all over human history. These archetypes, which are shared in the mind of the species, give a similar narrative to all humanity and even help individuals orient themselves towards a meaningful role in a larger story. We'll delve deeper into this in another video, but it's clear that morphic resonance is impactful and ever-present, influencing all beings through a realm of structures that cannot be touched or felt. Now, I know this might sound kind of crazy, but there are actually lots of studies and recorded data published by Sheldrake and others which conclude the existence of some form of telepathic communication. Just briefly, there's pretty clear evidence that dogs can sense when their owners are coming home, even when they come at completely random times. Also, if you've ever had the sense of being stared at and looked over to see someone looking at you, there's a recorded study done by Sheldrake which gives evidence for this phenomena being real, even though it is obviously not physically possible. He also suggests that memories may not be stored in the brain like a computer chip, but rather resonate with your brain from that moment in the past and interpret those signals like a radio picking up a frequency, even though the signal may become weaker over time. And among other instances, such as thinking of someone and getting a call from them, or tribes of people who know their hunters have made a kill and start the celebration before they arrive home. This is all to suggest that some form of unconscious telepathic communication might even be normal and present in our everyday lives. Obviously, I will leave links for all these studies below and everything mentioned in the video, so I encourage you to do your own research, actually look and make your own opinion on the subject rather than just embracing the common viewpoint. I'm also not here to tell anyone that I know conclusively the theory of morphic resonance is real. I think when talking about these fields or the nature of the divine, there is always an element that is somewhat necessarily hidden, never fully pinpointed or exposed in the same way we can prove the existence of an atom or a galaxy. It's more something you have to feel and experience in whole, as these things are ever present, not something that can be separated from the rest of the universe and defined in part. But in making this video, I just wanted more people to hear this very profound and elegant theory, as I hope it can provide some value to your cosmological worldview. That being said, I really do find so much value in the theory of morphic resonance on a scientific, metaphysical, spiritual, and philosophical level. I believe this potentially provides a foundation for an integrated theory of reality, which resonates with both ancient and modern philosophies about the universe being fundamentally unified and mind-like. Similarly, in Whiteheadian philosophy, God is the whole universe, which sees the potentialities for its existence and then evolves into them by using creativity to structure itself. This rings true in Vedantic teachings, integral theory, Taoist cosmology, the CTMU, Hermetic principles, Christianity, as Sheldrake himself is a Christian, and the list goes on. Check out any of my videos and you'll see this represented in many different teachings. Also, it is so profound and beautiful to think that the universe is self-organizing and habit-forming rather than made of concrete laws. This opens up a much more logical explanation of how the structures pervading the entire universe actually self-evolved into place rather than just somehow happened as a result of some random perfect chance. This also provides a scientific antidote to the model of the machine universe, which operates only by cold, unfeeling mechanisms and constants, with life seen as nothing more than some randomly emerging novelty feature. In my own life, this theory has helped me to understand and interpret many seemingly different realms of truth as well as everyday experience into a more unified, coherent perspective. Also, it opens up a way for consciousness to be granted back its free will by being transcendent of these morphic fields and giving a metaphysical space for dreams and conscious experience as we know it. Consciousness can use such fields to influence itself and the firing of its own neurons, which depends on a probability distribution as well. Through this theory, we can see the necessary role that life and consciousness play as a driving attractor of order, creativity, and beauty, which can overcome the nihilistic implications of the machine universe and grant a meaningful place for humanity in the cosmos. Human and other forms of intelligence therefore contain intrinsic value as creative actors which the universe conspires to ultimately produce in order for it to experience itself. Obviously, a theory as grand as this has been vehemently rejected by many academics within the realms of science and biology. It's no surprise, as morphic resonance provides a complete upheaval of the mechanistic, fragmented, and static paradigm that has defined modern science for nearly 4 decades and even pervades the modern understanding of progress, knowledge, and the separate self. Rupert Sheldrake's TED Talk from 2013, which described the 10 dogmatic assumptions of modern science, was banned from the TED website for promoting pseudoscience, although you can still watch it on other channels. Most academics use this same criticism of pseudoscience, a word that gets thrown around a lot today, because its fields are invisible and immaterial and therefore could not be proven. Obviously, Sheldrake does have data he believes proves morphic resonance, with many experiments implying the existence of collective learning and telepathic communication, which I'll leave links to below. But when Sheldrake brings this evidence to others' attention, like in the case of militant atheist figurehead Richard Dawkins, he said, "I don't want to talk about evidence," back in 2007 when Sheldrake was featured on his show Enemies of Reason. Now, some may criticize his methods of experimentation being biased, but truthfully the same can be said for almost anyone who does an experiment and looks for a specific result. I think the real reason it has received a lot of academic backlash is because we're just not ready for it yet. It requires a fundamental shift in the way we reason about existence and the nature of science entirely. But overall, it is good to criticize studies and be skeptical about such impactful claims. The problem then arises when people unceasingly cling to one ideology in spite of clear evidence, and will write articles criticizing a study and then not reply to an objection that their criticism is false. This happened in the case of physicist and science writer John Maddox, who labeled Sheldrake a heretic in his popular article on morphic resonance, a book for burning. Seems as if you wouldn't need to burn a book if you could actually prove it is wrong, but anyway, I think Sheldrake is largely unbothered by these attacks and always seems to have an air of peace and happiness in the way he carries himself, which is very respectable in today's age. Also, I doubt many would honestly claim that Sheldrake's theory comes from a place of evil or harm, as dating back to the 1980s, Sheldrake could be seen sitting in kumbaya with the likes of Terence McKenna and engaging in genuine speculation and wonder about the nature of reality. So overall, I think it will take time for this perspective of an evolving universe with memory to take hold in humanity, but I believe it is inevitable that we will find truth synonymous with the theory, and Sheldrake will be regarded as a scientific and philosophical pioneer. Other modern theories of reality, which resonate with ancient ideas about the universe being mind-like, are being revitalized as we speak, and one of my videos about the cognitive theoretic model of the universe has gotten a lot of traction on YouTube, so check that video out if you feel like going down a pretty sick and maybe life-changing rabbit hole today. Also, please subscribe to my channel, hit that like button, and comment below. It is only by people paying attention to enlightening new perspectives such as these that we can ever defeat the machine universe. As always, never stop questioning, talking, and thinking. Thank you.